Hello, welcome back to the first video of 2025. This is a video I've wanted to do for quite a while now. I see a lot of new painters in Facebook groups I'm in the comments here, children that I work with in schools, and there's a lot of kind of not misinformation, but there's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of expectations, I think, that I just kind of want to talk about how you can get started painting that first miniature that you've bought. It might be a single miniature that you've received as a present. It might be an army you've bought yourself. But I just want to kind of give you, not necessarily the tips that I didn't have when I started, but some of the tips that I wish I listened to when I started. People told me some of this stuff and I didn't really listen. Some of it I just didn't really hear at the time. So I just kind of want to go through my top tips really that I think will get you from that bare plastic to something that you're happy with. I'm not going to go into loads of advanced techniques here. There's other videos out there. I might do some of those in the future, but this is just about getting started, getting some paint on that first miniature, and kind of how to deal with all of the stuff that comes with that. So without further ado, let's jump into tip number one. The absolute first thing is to not judge yourself by other people's work. And that's really hard to do. I still do it. I've been painting a long time now. I still judge myself against other people's work. But especially in the beginning, try not to judge yourself against other people's work. This isn't Lego. You know, if you get a box of Lego and you follow the instructions, by the end of it, you should have something that looks identical to what is on the front of the box. If you get a cross stitch or a paint by numbers or any of those other kind of hobbies, and you follow the instructions that come with it, you should end up with something that looks like the box art. That's not true with this hobby. Okay, your first minis, when you pick up that box art and you start to paint, your minis are not going to look like that box art. Okay, the heavy metal painters for Games Workshop that paint on the box art, they've been doing this for decades. Okay, they've been painting for a long time. They're using loads of different advanced techniques. They know what they're doing. They've been doing it for a while. So their stuff is going to be way up here, and when you're starting, your stuff's going to be down here, and that's absolutely fine. Everything we start new, we have to start somewhere. And it's the same online. You will get people in Facebook groups or on Reddit threads saying, oh, I'm new to this, what do you think to this? And then they pull out something that looks absolutely amazing. And it may be that they are new and they're just gifted with it. But it may also be that they're just looking for a bit of self-validation. They're looking for a bit of approval. And that's also absolutely fine. But if you start judging yourself against them thinking, well, they're new, why is theirs amazing? You're just going to get down and depressed and you're going to stop wanting to do the hobby. The only person you should be judging your painting against is your own painting from last time. Look at what you painted last time, look at what you painted this time, and think, am I happier with this? Okay? Don't try and look at it as, oh, okay, I really don't like this first one, I'm going to try and improve everything about it. That's a lot to take on. That's a lot to improve. You might want to look at it and think, actually, you know what, I'm just going to try and improve the shadows areas. Or I'm going to try and improve the metallics that I'm painting. Or I'm going to try and improve my dry brushing over the chainmail. Just pick one tiny thing that you think you might be able to improve next time and focus on that. And that's the only thing you should be judging against is, am I happy with what I've painted this time to what I painted last time? Nobody else's stuff matters. It's also really subjective. Okay, the artwork on Games Workshop minis is painted by the heavy metal team at Games Workshop, and that has quite a cartoony, bold style because it photographs really well. I'm not a huge fan of that. I prefer minis that have been painted more realistically, perhaps, that have got more grime, more grunge, more weathering on them. That's how I like to paint my minis. That's the kind of minis that I like to see. Doesn't mean one's better than the other. And that's the problem. You could be looking at something that you think, oh, I want it to be like that. But actually, that isn't necessarily better. It's just different. So only judge your work against your own stuff that you did last time. Forget everybody else's. Next up is the fact that you are going to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes when they're painting. I make mistakes. Absolute pro painters make mistakes when they're painting minis. It isn't the end of the world. And it's really hard going into this because, you know, minis are not cheap. Okay, especially if you're buying plastic minis from people like Games Workshop, they are not cheap. Okay, an army set could set you back 70, 80, 100 plus pounds. A big individual mini like the Avatar of Cain up there could be 70, 80 pounds. That feels like a lot of money to go wrong on. But the top secret here is, and it's not really a secret for people who've been painting for a while, but the thing to remember is nothing is permanent. You are painting with acrylic paints. Okay, if you don't like what you've done, throw it into a tub of isopropyl alcohol or methylated spirits, the purple stuff that you can get from Poundland or anywhere like that. Leave it there overnight. In the morning, go at it with a toothbrush and all of that paint will come off. All of the primer will come off and you will be left with a bare model ready to start again. Okay, it isn't permanent. Even if you've got all the way through your mini and you've got loads of stuff on there that you're really pleased with and then you make a little mistake, don't worry about it. If you've been painting with thin layers, which we'll talk about in a bit, you can just paint over it. Okay, you're not going to fill in all of that detail if you're thinning your paints properly. So you can just go over it. Nothing is permanent with this thing. It's really scary. I get it. I was the same when I first started. You know, I was desperately, you know, part of the reason why some of these are still in their boxes is because I'm still a little bit intimidated by starting them. And I'm thinking, right, well, you know, if I start them and I go wrong and, you know, a lot of these were gifts, but I've got to get over that. You've got to get over that, okay? We can undo all of these things that we do. It isn't permanent. So don't worry about making mistakes, okay? You can either paint over them or you can just strip the mini back to plastic or back to metal or back to resin if they're 3D printed and start again. Absolutely fine. No damage done. Dead easy to do. Okay, you've got the model out of the box, you've gone through the painstaking process of snipping it all off, you've glued it all together, you want to paint it. What do you need to do first? Paint doesn't want to stick to plastic or resin or metal. It just doesn't. And if you paint your models without priming them, as soon as you start to play with them or handle them, that paint will start to chip off and flake off and you'll undo all of your hard work. Priming them is essential. But it doesn't have to be expensive. Now, most of you, if you're just starting out, I'm going to guess you've probably got Games Workshop figures, you've probably got Games Workshop paints, and you've got Games Workshop primer. Absolutely fine. They're really good products. They're just a little bit expensive, especially when it comes to primer. There are other companies as well. I don't use Games Workshop primer because it is quite expensive. If I want a particular colour, I tend to go for Army Painter stuff. It's a little bit cheaper, goes on nicely. But for the bulk of the stuff I do, I use this high coat stuff, which is quite cheap from Amazon. I think the Games Workshop primer is about £13-14 here in the UK. Last time I checked, it might be even more now. This stuff is about £6 a can. This stuff's even cheaper from Poundland. This is about £1.50, £2 a can. And this is great, especially for terrain. It goes on a little bit thicker, but it's especially great for terrain. The thing when you are priming your mini is you are only putting down a key for your paint to stick to. Your entire mini doesn't have to be black or white. You just need to get a very fine layer on there so that the paint you're going to put on will stick to it. Now, there might be times when you want to build it up so that it is solid white or solid black, and that's absolutely fine, but do it in multiple layers. This is something I really wish I'd listened to back in the beginning. I look back to some of my old minis now, and I just went over one coat to try and get it white, and that is a surefire way that you will fill in all of the little details on your mini. And then you'll have to strip it back and start again. It is much easier to build it up. It's frustrating because it takes a little bit longer, but primer dries pretty quickly, especially in a warm room. It will dry in 10 minutes and you can put another layer on, but you just want to dust it. Okay, go straight over it with a thin dust, and I'll show you a tool in a bit that will really help with that when I talk about tools in a little bit. But it is just about building up a base layer for your paint to go on. I see a lot of questions about what colour primer to use, and it really depends on what you are going to do with your mini. We'll talk about different types of paint in a bit. If you're going to be using contrast paints or speed paints, you'll probably want to go for a lighter primer. You want to go for white or a kind of beige or Wraithbone from Games Workshop, something like that, because the contrast will be a lot more vibrant and a lot more pop. You can paint it over black, it'd just be a lot darker, but it's something to experiment with. The colour you prime with will affect the paints you put on it, even if you're putting on normal paints that aren't contrast or speed paints. It will affect them less, but it will affect it a little bit, especially if you're putting on thin coats and you're blending. If I'm painting darker models, I tend to start with black. If I'm painting lighter models, I tend to start with white. You might hear about a zenithal prime, which is where you prime it in black and then hit it with white from the top to give some color variance, to give like lights and shadows. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that here because that's a more advanced technique. But so you can mix them. For instance, if you prime with a pink and then you paint over with yellow paint, they will appear much warmer. For instance, it will give you a much more vibrant, rich yellow colour. So it's something to experiment with as you get further along in your journey. For now, I would stick with a black, a white, a grey or a beige. And remember, just thin coats, light dustings with it, just to give it a key. And then you can put your paints on top of it. That's its only job. However, there are different circumstances. If you are painting a whole army of something and they have a lot of one particular colour, then you might want to prime in that colour, okay? And that is a really useful way to get a lot of your bulk painting done really, really quickly. For instance, when I painted my Eldari army, this was when I first got back into the hobby a while back, these need a bit of work doing to them, but it was so much easier to prime these in red and then add the other details than it would have been to prime them in white, paint all the red on, paint all the black, and so on and so forth. By actually adding that primer into the mix and actually thinking ahead, right, what is the bulk colour of my models, it just made it a lot easier and a lot quicker. And again, that's why Army Painter are really good, because they have such a wide range of primer colours, which work really well. Games Workshop have a good range as well, but from what I remember, they can only keep, I think it's 12 colours in their range at any time, so they fall out every now and again. They'll drop colours and they'll add new colours, whereas Army Painter just have a massive range that they just kind of seem to keep in stock all of the time, and they quite closely match the GW paints as well, the Games Workshop paints. So they are useful, Army Painter, if you want a particular colour to prime a big army with in particular. Let's talk about paints. We are living now in a golden age of paints for our hobby. There are so many different brands out there, from Vallejo, Tooth and Coats, Pro Acryl, Army Painter, Games Workshop Citadel, and loads more that I completely forgotten there. And they are all good. They all do a very similar job. You will probably eventually find one that you prefer. My favourites are the Tooth and Coats, although I do like the Army Painter Speed Paints. If I'm trying to do things really quickly, I use contrast paints from GW when I need to. I've still got my old GW Games Workshop paints that I will use every now and then. I like the Dark Star Metallics. So there are lots of different ones out there. And they tend to come really in two different types. There are what I will call paints or normal paints. And they are the ones that most people are used to using. They're like the Games Workshop, the Tooth and Coats, Pro Acryl, whatever. And they are just acrylic paints that you thin down and you paint onto your models. Then there are the new ones that have been out for a few years now, things like contrast paints and Army Painter speed paints. And they are more like a thick glaze, and you put those on and they naturally fill in the recesses to create shadows, and they don't quite go as much on the highlights. It's a bit magic really how it works, but they are really good for fine detail. So if you're painting things like hair or fur or bones and things like that, they've got lots of crevices and nooks and crannies. They work really well on those, especially if you're just starting out, although I use them a lot for touching in details. They're a lot quicker than normal paints. If you just want something quick for a whole army, they can be quick. But they don't work as well over flat surfaces. So they don't work as well for things like armour or for cloaks and stuff like that, because they have a tendency to leave tidal marks and they blotch and things like that over flat surfaces. When I talk about paints, I'm talking about the normal paints. When I talk about contrast paints, I'm talking about contrast or speed paints or things like that. I imagine that most of you, if you're just starting out, will have Games Workshop paints, because that's what most of us start with. And that's absolutely brilliant. They're good paints, but they're great paints. They work really well, and they do what they need to do. So I'm going to refer mainly to Games Workshop paints and contrast paints, but know that it can be interchanged with other things. When you are painting, and this is something I really struggled with at the beginning, try to get hung up on paint names. So if you're watching a video and you think, oh, that looks really good, I wonder what paints I've used, instead of thinking, right, is that, I don't know, is that Mephiston Red, or is that Incubi Darkness? You know, what is that paint that they're using? Try, if you can, from the beginning to think about what is just the colour and the shade they are using, because they can interchange. If you start to think about, actually, that's just a dark blue with a slightly lighter blue and then a light blue on top to build up that gradient, that's much more useful for you in the long term than getting fixated on, oh, that's this blue and then that particular blue and then that particular blue, because you can get a bit hamstrung by that. And I was like that for a long time. It wasn't until I started experimenting with other paint ranges that I started to really think about, actually, this is just a colour going from one shade to another. I don't need to worry exactly what the colour name is or what brand it is or things like that. So I would, if you can, recommend start from the beginning, just thinking about the colours rather than the colour names, rather than the specific colours. And experiment with any different paints you've got, how they work. But there are those two types of paints. They're the paints, and then there are the contrast / speed paint type of paints. They all have different jobs. They all do different things really well. They're all good at what they do. So it doesn't matter which ones you've got. They might just need to be worked with slightly differently. And I'll talk about that in the next section. Right, this is a big one. Thin your paints. This was advice that I was given for a long time and I completely ignored it. Okay, I kind of thought, well, they're giving me the paints in the tub. Surely that's how they want me to use it. But it's not. You need to treat the paints in your tub as a bit like cordial that you would make juice with in the kitchen. They are designed to be thinned down. Now, this is different if you're using contrast paints or speed paints. They don't need to be thinned down. They should be used straight from the pot or from the dropper bottle. You might want to thin them down later on for more advanced techniques, but for now, they can be used straight from the pot, straight from the dropper bottle. So if you're using contrast paints or speed paints, you can skip this section if you want to, but it is worth bearing in mind and having a think and a listen to as well. So the paint in a normal pot or a normal dropper bottle is very, very concentrated. And if you paint a model with that, there's a very good chance that you will start to fill in details when it dries. So you'll start to lose details in faces or in things like branches or any of that kind of fine detail. When it dries thick, so it will leave your brush strokes in there. If you're painting with the brush and you're leaving strokes in, they will dry in there. It can leave tide marks almost where it's slightly thicker than the layer below and you've got a little ridge. It's just not designed to be used that way. And it took me a long time to accept this piece of advice. So please listen to me here and follow this if you can. And it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to, don't fret too much about the exact amount of thinning that you need. If you go too far and thin it too much, you'll know, because it will be like a wash and you'll put it on and it will just run everywhere and you'll just need to get a bit of tissue or kitchen roll and just dab it off and think, actually, I've thinned that down too much. Ideally, you want it so that it just flows nicely from your brush. And we'll talk about brushes in a little bit. But it needs to be thinner so that you can put on a layer and it will flow nicely. It'll flow off of your brush. It will flow into the details where it needs to, but it won't fill them up. And that will be I can't sit here and say you need 2 parts water to 1 pot paint, because all paints are different, even within the same range, even within the Games Workshop range. Some paints will need more thinning than other paints. Some paints you can thin down even more to get, different effect, to get layering or feathering or different blending techniques. Again, advanced techniques, not for now. So that's why they come concentrated, because different painters will kind of thin them down differently for different applications. So it's about trial and error. It's about just adding a little bit of water to it, not in the pot. Get a bit of paint out and put it onto a surface. Now, non-porous surfaces are much better for this. So even if you've got a plastic dinner plate or something that you give the kids or something like that, or an old porcelain tile or a normal plate, just get a normal plate that you don't use anymore and use that. Something that isn't going to suck moisture out of the paint. If you use something like a paper plate or a bit of kitchen roll or, a piece of wood, that will start to very quickly suck the moisture out of the paint as soon as you put it onto there. And that will then make your job a whole lot harder. So you want something non-porous to put your paint on. And you just need to put a dab of it onto your paint, add a little bit of water, and just slowly start to thin it out until you get something that you think, or you learn to feel, actually, that's a nice thing. This will make the biggest difference to your first painting experiences. If you're trying to do your first model straight from the pot, you're not going to be happy with the result. It's going to look blobby, it's going to look blotchy, it's going to look weird and clumpy, and you're just not going to be happy with it. If you do this from the beginning, you will be much more happy with what you get at the end. It does take time. You know, if you're going to paint, especially if you're painting over a darker primer, it might take you 2 or 3 layers to build it up. That's why Duncan Rhodes' paint range is called 2 thin coats. That was his big catchphrase, was 2 thin coats. You're better to do 2 thin coats than 1 thick coat. If you're priming with a lighter colour, you can probably get away with 2 thin coats. It again depends on the colour. Yellows are notoriously low pigmented, so they tend to need more coats to get a good solid yellow base. Something like a black will probably go on with 1 coat, even with it thinned down. So you've just got to experiment. But honestly, this is the one piece of advice I wish I had listened to, and that will make the most difference for your painting experience, is to thin them down and use them thinned down. Okay? Try it. Thank me later, and thank every other YouTuber out there, every other content creator, every other painter out there who is hammering home this same message, because it really will make a huge difference. Okay, if a bad workman always blames their tools, then our tools that we really need to look after and we really need to pay attention to are these things, paintbrushes. And there's a lot of contention about paintbrushes. For a long time, I bought cheap paintbrushes, and they can do a job, but they don't last as long. Now, before we go into all that, we really need to look at the anatomy of a paintbrush, because it really matters. I didn't learn this until probably a year ago, really. The different parts of a brush and actually why they matter to what we're doing and what you're doing right from the very beginning. Because again, if you've just started out, you've probably gone out and bought yourself, or you've been brought some nice paintbrushes, you've got some nice paints, and you want them to last. You want them to keep being good for the next 10, 20, 30 years. That's a bit of a lie, they're not going to last that long. But you might, you want them to last for a good couple of years before they start to degrade. And if you don't look after them, even expensive brushes will start to fall apart after a month or 2 months. So there is a lot of information out there. There's a lot of opinions out there. I'm just going to give you my opinion. Cheap paintbrushes are fine, but they will not last as long, or they'll be harder to take care of for fine detail work. Now, they're great for keeping, like this is a cheap brush, and you can see the end has gone really fluffy, and we'll talk about why that is in a minute. This is great for painting terrain or for painting big bits of terrain. I can just use it, I can abuse it, I can bash the paint onto houses or rocks or whatever, and it's absolutely fine. And then I keep the finer tipped ones for my models. We have got 2 different brushes here. Okay, so if we look, we've got, these are both Artis Opus, size 1 and size 0. Now, we've got different parts to the brush, so I'm trying to stop these from rolling off. We have got right here at the end, this is called the tip. Okay, and if you look, both of them have got a nice pointed tip. Okay, they've both got the same point on the tip, and that's important. We'll come back to that in a bit. Then further down, you've got the fatter part of the brush, which is called the body. Okay, and that is really, really important, because the body is where your paintbrush will store paint. When you put it into your paint, when you thin it down, you take up the paint, it will get stored in your body of your brush. And that's where you want it to be. Okay, and then this metal bit is called the ferrule. And this is where the fibres of the brush, whether they're synthetic fibres, whether they are Kolinsky fur or sable fur, whatever they are held in place by the ferrule. What you want to try and avoid at all costs is paint getting into the ferrule. Because if paint gets up here into the ferrule or water and starts to dry, paint in particular, what it will do is it will push apart your bristles. So if we take a look at this brush, you can see, this is my battered brush that I was talking about earlier. You can see here all of this gunk that is kind of collected up at the top, and that's gone all the way back into the ferrule. Don't worry about this, isn't actual rust, that's dirty down rust. But you can see it's gone back into the ferrule. And what that does as it dries is it pushes out the bristles at the top, and that's why this brush now is pretty much impossible to get to a fine point. When I first had it new, The point on this brush was as fine as the point on this brush. But through years, well, months of neglect, years of neglect, it is now like this, and it will never have a point like that again. Because all of this paint has got up there, and probably a little bit of glue or Mod Podge or something, because I pretty much abuse it now. So your main aim is to try and avoid getting paint into this ferrule. And you do that by not overloading your brush, making sure you wash it out properly, but also when you wash it out, store it lying down. Let it dry lying down. If you let it dry standing up, gravity will pull all of that stuff into the ferrule, and that will make it a lot harder to keep pristine. Okay, and this is one of the main differences between expensive brushes and cheap brushes. More expensive brushes, like these Artis Opus ones, are so packed with fibres that their ferrule is very hard to get paint into the ferrule because there's more fibres there. They're more densely packed. Cheaper brushes are less densely packed, and so there's more space for paint and water to get up into the ferrule, which will then start to ruin them. You will get tip splits as well, so your tip will just start to split, which makes it really hard to do any kind of decent detail work with. Now, because we are storing paint in the body of the brush, and you can see here they both have the same tip, actually you are better where possible to use a bigger brush, even if you're doing detailed work, because the tip size, which is what you're actually going to be putting paint on with most of the time, is the same. But what the bigger brush will do is it will hold more paint in the body, which means it will dry out less slowly, which means it will dry out more slowly. Okay, which is what you want. You don't want the paint to dry out in your brush because it will stop coming off of your brush. So if you put a tiny amount into a small brush, that will dry out quicker than if you put a decent amount into a slightly bigger brush. So I normally paint with a size 1 or a size 2 brush. And then for things like eyes or very, very fine detail, I'll go in with a 0 where I need to be able to get that smaller head in. But generally most work is done with a 1 or a 2 because the tip size is the same. It's just you get more paint into the body of your brush. So again, if you start with that from the beginning and you start looking after your brushes from the beginning, they will last longer, you will have a much more enjoyable experience, and your painting will be easier because you're using a decent tool for the job. So even if you've got a cheap brush, so this one here was a cheap set from Amazon, and you can see starting to get a little bit of tip curl up here, because I've not really looked after it as much as I should, but it still has a very fine point on it, because this one I haven't allowed paint to get up into the ferrule, and I have looked after it a little bit better. Okay, so it's still not great, it's still not one of my best brushes, but it has kept a point because I've looked after it a little bit better. Okay, and this is a cheap paintbrush, but it's a bit harder work, and you can see the tip is starting to curl, but if I put some hair conditioner onto there or some hair wax or something like that and hold it into place, when I wash it off it should be fine. So yeah, bear that in mind. Okay, hopefully so far things you've taken away from this is that you need your paint to be thinned and you need it to be fluid so that it comes off of your brush, and you'll need your body of your brush to be filled with that paint so that it can flow off nicely. With that in mind, don't worry about wasting your paint. This is still a big thing for me. I have to fight to overcome. But paints are expensive, I get that. So what there is a tendency for us to do is to try and use the bare minimum to do what we need to do. So you put a tiny bit on your brush and then try and paint with it. Or if you're using a palette to thin it down, you put a tiny bit on and try and thin it down. The problem with that is it will dry out very, very quickly. And it will become unusable very quickly, the bit that you have got out. So if you put a tiny bit on your brush, it is going to dry out before you've painted the thing you want to paint. And then you'll be washing your brush and you have to get more, and it becomes cumbersome and it can damage the brushes. And actually you end up using more paint because you're wasting that dried stuff. If you put a decent amount onto your brush, hopefully thinned down, that will last longer and before drying out. So it will last longer and you'll be able to paint more of your model with that colour that you need. And yeah, there'll be a little bit at the end that you wash away, but not a lot. I've got paints that I've been using for the last 3 or 4 years that I haven't run out of. Okay, you're using such a small amount anyway, you're not really going to go through that much. by using a little bit more to make sure you've got enough on your brush, to make sure you've got enough on your palette that you're thinning down. Don't worry about wasting it. Okay, I promise you, you are not going to run out very quickly unless you do the classic thing, which everybody does normally with Null oil, which is knock it over and it just floods everywhere all over your table. My painting desk has that many different stains on it from paints that I've knocked over. That's a different story. But through painting itself, you are not going to run out very quickly just by using a little bit more paint. Again, it will give you a much better result if you allow yourself to have a little bit more paint there, use it a little bit more liberally. You will get a better result and you'll be happier with the process. You won't get as frustrated. You won't sit there thinking, well, why is this paint not, there's nothing worse than getting to that part of your model where you need to paint the eyes maybe, or a tiny little part of a shield, and you get paint on your brush and you go to do it and it won't come off, or it won't come off evenly, and you dot it and you splodge it and you're so frustrated, why hasn't that come off? And it's because it's dried on your brush. And it will dry very quickly, especially if you're in a warm room or you're in a dry area. If you put a tiny amount on your brush, it will dry within 30 seconds, okay, especially if it's not been thinned down. So you don't give yourself much working time. Now, there will be times where you want a little bit. If you're dotting a pupil on an eye or something, you want a tiny amount, that's fine. But again, you'd thin it down a little bit and you could work quickly. But generally, don't be afraid of putting more paint onto your pad, a little bit more paint into the body of your brush. Remember, you don't want it so much that it pushes up into the ferrule, but you want enough that it fills the body of your brush, not just the tip. You don't want it just on the tip, you want it to fill the body of your brush. So don't be afraid of wasting the paints that you've got, okay? I know they're expensive, but if you use them properly, they will last you for years, okay? Even with this tip. So don't worry about it. Okay, this is a killer. Make sure you let your paint dry between layers. Okay, now there are more advanced techniques where you perhaps don't want to do this and you want to blend them together, but for now, please let your paint dry between layers. And this took me a long time to do. It took me a long time to realize because I'm very impatient, and I will paint a layer of color on and then I want to get the next layer on straight away, especially if I'm doing two thin coats or if I'm thinning my paints a lot and I'm building up in several layers. I just want to get that color done. But the paint will not stick to your model and your primer properly until it is dry. So if you start painting another layer over it, all that is going to do is reactivate the first layer, smudge it, move it out of the way, create little clumps in your paint, create tide marks, and it will be infuriating. You'll get a really bad finish. You'll be really frustrated and you'll think, well, I've thinned my coats. Why is Matt lying to me? Why am I not getting nice coats here? You have to let it dry. Now, I'm not saying you have to let it dry for 24 hours or, 2 days or whatever, but give it 10 minutes, give it 15, 20 minutes, let it dry. You can use if you're that desperate, use a hairdryer gently on it and that will dry it out. But make sure the layer before is dry before you put another layer on. This is especially true if you're painting with things like contrast paints or speed paints, because they take longer to dry and they will really mess up if you try and put another layer on top or put another paint on top. It will just push everything everywhere. You'll ruin your shadows, you'll ruin your highlights, and you'll have to kind of start again. So just be patient. I know that's hard, okay? And that is what put me off thinning my paints for the longest time, was the fact that I'm impatient. And I thought, you know what, I just don't want to wait for multiple layers to dry. Some of these bits are hard to get to on a model. Some of the detail is quite fine. I just want to paint it and be done. I don't want to have to paint it and then come back and paint it again to get a solid colour, and then maybe come back and paint it a third time. It's a tricky part to paint. But that is the only way you're going to get nice results that you are happy with. Okay, putting a big blob of paint on there and thinking, great, done, nice solid colour, is not going to get you the results that you want. And ironically, it would take longer to dry anyway because the paint's thicker and you've put a bigger layer on it. So you are better to put those thin layers on, let it dry, come back, put another layer on, let it dry, and do as many layers as you need to. This is a really key piece of advice. Take it or leave it, but take it. And just be a little bit patient with it, because it will make a huge difference to the finished surface of your paint. Right, we've talked about paintbrushes, which is one of the most essential tools that you need for painting minis, obviously. There are very few other tools that I think are essential for painting that I couldn't do without. And these two are pretty much the only two. And this one I could do without. It's just a great time saver. So I'll start with this one. This is about the only Games Workshop tool that I recommend to people. And this is a spray handle. So it just comes with elastic bands. You can put your minis in here by wedging the base in between the elastic bands. You take them outside and you can prime them all at once. Just quick couple over, run over. You can fit, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've got 10 elastic bands. You can probably fit 12 or 13 minis on there. Depends how big the bases are. It makes priming them a lot quicker and a lot easier. Not essential, but if you're going to buy anything with any Christmas money you've got, I would get one of these. It's a time saver. It's not essential, but it is a good time saver. These, I think, are essential. And it doesn't have to be this one. This is a 3D printed one. This is called a painting handle. Games Workshop sell them. Other brands sell them. You know, you can get 3D printed ones. Or you can just use a wine cork with a bit of blue tack on it, or old film canister, ask your parents, with a bit of blue tack on it. What you want is something that you can hold with the miniature on top, so that you're not getting your fingers all over the mini. You don't want to be holding the mini by its base to paint it, because you're going to slip, you'll drop it, you'll get your fingers in the paint. Something like this, it's much more ergonomic. I go for this one because I like the feel of this one in my hand. It stops me getting hand cramp if I'm doing a lot of painting. And it just makes it much easier to control where the mini is, okay? And you need to be able to control where the mini is, because that is the best way, I think, to start to paint. And I'll show you what I mean. Okay, I've got a Stormcast Eternal here. I've primed it gold because I'm putting these together as trophies for the workshops, the Quest and Quills workshops that are in the school. So ignore the fact that it's primed gold. But let the miniature do the work when you're painting, and paint handles make this so much easier. If I'm painting something there, I can run my brush like that. But if I want to paint something there, I'm not going to sit here and try and paint it like that, because I'm going the wrong way. I'm moving the brush in the wrong way. I want to move the brush towards me. With a paint handle, I can turn that upside down like that. I'm not touching the mini, and then I can paint towards me again. So I'm moving the brush in that same direction, and if I need to do it that way, I can do that, and I can move the brush in that direction. Really, when you're painting, you just want to be moving the brush towards you all the time. You don't want to be trying to go that way or putting your arm and things into different positions to paint. So a paint handle, whatever it is, whether it's a cork with some blue tack on it or it's a designed paint handle like this, allows you to move that mini around to get it into a right position. You know, if you've got a really difficult position like his underarm, I don't want to be having to hold the base and trying to get in there, because now my finger's touching the back of it. If there's wet paint there, I've got fingerprints in it, I've smudged it, okay? I want to keep it as away from my fingers as possible. So putting it into something like this, again, means I can get under there and I can pull the paint towards me and I can paint underneath the armpit. So I think these are probably one of the most essential tools outside of a paintbrush. If you can get yourself a paint handle somehow, or something to hold with your miniature stuck on top of it, it will make it much easier on your hands. It will make it much easier to maneuver that miniature into a comfortable position to paint, and it will make it much, much better. Another top tip I was given whilst we're talking about this is this: if you can paint with your elbows on the table or on a surface, it's much easier because you've got much steadier hands and you've got much more control. If you're sat trying to paint these on your knee while you're watching TV, it might work for some people, but you've got a lot more give, you've got a lot more wobble. If you can have something firm to put your arms onto to paint, it'll make a great difference to what you are achieving at the end. Okay, thank you for watching. Hopefully this has been useful. Do you have any of your own tips that you wish you'd known at the beginning, or that you'd like to share with other people? Drop them in the comments. I would love to hear them. Is there anything that I've missed? Anything you've got wrong? Anything that you think, actually, that's not great advice for a new painter. I would sooner do it this way. Let's have a chat about it. I'm always open to hearing new ideas. These are just things that I wish I'd kind of paid attention to, or I wish I'd listened to, or I wish I'd known about when I started painting, or even further on in my career as well. So I hope you've enjoyed it. As always, like and subscribe. You know, we're starting to get a few more subscribers now, which is great. I like doing these videos. I've got a feeling this one might be an algorithm killer. I don't think this will do as well as some of the Mordheim stuff I've done recently, but I think it's an important video, and hopefully you've enjoyed watching it. So see you next time. Click those like and subscribe buttons, and see you later.